Good morning. I'm going to show you an old clip from a game show that was originally aired in 1977. And then I'll tell you a secret that once you understand it, will provide you with the key to understanding how the world works in 2023. Ready?
I just wish you'd give him another chance. So, all right, let's give him another chance. Lay it on now. Here comes
Here's the secret. The host of that show, Chuck Barris, worked for the CIA.
The CIA denies that Chuck Barris ever worked for them, and Barris told NBC's The Today Show that he had made up the story for his fictionalized biography Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Barris said, "No, I was never a CIA hitman. I never did those things. I once applied for the CIA, and while I was going through the process, I got a job and went on television."
Okay, but the world we're living in now will make more sense if you at least allow yourself to suspect that despite the denials, it's possible, even likely, that Chuck Barris worked for the CIA. Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and this video will explain the French radical Guy Debord's concept of the spectacle. Specifically, it will attempt to make sense of these lines from Debord's 1988 book, Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. The government of the spectacle, which now possesses all the means to falsify the whole of production and perception, is the absolute master of memories, just as it is the unfettered masters of projects that will shape the most distant future. It reigns unchecked. It executes its summary judgments. And it is in these conditions that a parodic end of the division of labor suddenly appears, with carnivalesque gaiety. All the more welcome because it coincides with the generalized disappearance of all true competence. Where the possession of mediatic status has acquired infinitely more importance than the value of anything one might actually be capable of doing, it is normal for this status to be easily transferable and to confer the right to shine in the same fashion to anyone, anywhere. Most often, these accelerated media particles pursue their simple orbit of statutorily guaranteed admiration. But it happens that the mediatic transition provides the cover for many enterprises, officially independent, but in fact secretly linked by various ad hoc networks, with the result that occasionally the social division of labor, along with the easily foreseeable solidarity of its use, reappears in quite new forms. For example, one can now publish a novel in order to arrange an assassination. Such picturesque examples also go to show that one should never trust someone because of their job. But the greatest ambition of the integrated spectacular is still that secret agents become revolutionaries, and that revolutionaries become secret agents.
Miles, oh, your heart is breaking. Miles, even though it's breaking.
Most contemporary critical theorists misunderstand Debord's theory. They mystify it. For instance, let's talk about plastic pills and his video on the spectacle.
Now you know probably the spectacle very well because you live in it every day and carry it in your pocket. I don't need to explain any of that. But you may appropriately be asking, what is the big deal? Why now? No culture's never not had an imaginary. There's been art, architecture, theater for a long time. But the big deal with it is, and the reason this book came out when it did, is the TV. Before the TV, these imaginary experiences were almost always public. They created crowds as a corollary to them. And with the TV and its descendants, there's no longer a social crowd corresponding to the images. TVs, cars, suburbs, phones, Uber Eats, they all isolate under the value heading of convenience.
In this segment, Plastic Pills reduces Debord's critique to the level of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, a book that argued that the United States had undergone an unprecedented collapse in civic, social, and political life since the 1960s. And he blames the acquisitiveness and laziness of everyday people, or at least could be read that way.
Maybe you've never been in a bowling establishment before. Or perhaps you have, and it wasn't this kind of place. The carefully supervised kind that millions of discriminating bowlers take for granted today.
Listening to it, you get the impression that Debord is a philosopher, that his books are epistemological, that he was writing about the difference between what we imagine and what is real. Plastic Pills refers to the spectacle in terms of culture, of art, of video games, of movies, and he describes the spectacle as being a kind of prison for the individual. A prison that keeps you cut off, atomized, like Iron Man inside his suit, totally manipulated and controlled by the images and algorithms that control the suit. However, while Debord does critique movies and celebrities as aspects of the spectacle, and while he does rail against the atomization and fragmentation that he claims is a result of the capitalist spectacle, to focus on that aspect of his critique is to miss the overall aim of Debord's works. In his comments on the Society of the Spectacle, Debord described the reaction to his first book this way: I was always accused of indulging myself to excess in my evaluation of the spectacle's depth and unity, and its real working. I must admit that others who later published new books on the same subject demonstrated that it was quite possible to say less. All they had to do was replace the totality and its movement with a single static detail on the surface of the phenomenon, with each author demonstrating his originality by choosing a different and all the less disturbing one. The key to avoiding the error of fragmenting Debord's theory, the way to make sure that you don't reduce Debord to a mere philosopher of mind, or even worse, a critic of culture, is to understand that the spectacle is first and foremost a political system. While it's true that it's a political system that reduces the polity to mere spectators or consumers of images, and while it's true that the spectacle always reduces choice and autonomy to the level of choosing between what to consume rather than what to produce, and it does hide productive choices behind images, nonetheless, these choices about what to produce are made and even reported.
When you read Time each week, you know more. You understand.
They are made in the realm of politics. That doesn't mean the choices are only made by politicians who pass legislation and enact policies, but rather that material production, commerce, the market, and the management of the state are all political, and within the spectacle, all politics are mediated by images. Even though the spectacle obscures this in an effort to present the world as images that are separate from politics and political decisions.
In short review, time brings it all right home to you.
Plastic Pills claimed that the rise of television was what caused Debord to write about the spectacle.
But the big deal with it is, and the reason this book came out when it did, is the TV.
But it wasn't television that altered the character of capital, but rather the altered character of capitalism that created TV. The spectacle arose as capitalist politicians around the world embraced the state as the organizer and regulator of the market and capitalist production both. And while Marxists such as Theodor Adorno described the media environment as the culture industry, Debord called it the spectacle. Both the Frankfurt School Marxists and the Situationists understood the new media environment as one that bred conformity and accommodation. In his comments on the Society of the Spectacle, Debord wrote, "Never has censorship been more perfect. Never has the opinion of those who are still led to believe, in several countries, that they remain free citizens been less authorized to make themselves known whenever it is a matter of choices affecting their real lives. Never has it been possible to lie to them with a perfect absence of consequences. The spectator is simply supposed to know nothing and deserve nothing. Those who are always watching to see what happens next will never act. Such must be the spectator's condition." People often cite the United States as an exception, because there, Nixon came to an end due to a series of denials whose clumsiness was too cynical. But this entirely local exception, for which there were some old historical causes, clearly no longer holds true, since Reagan has recently been able to do the same thing with impunity.
Sock it to me?
Debord is, of course, referring to the Watergate scandal that took down President Richard Nixon. Nixon had resorted to dirty tricks during the '72 presidential election cycle. He sent CIA operatives to break into the headquarters of the DNC and tap the phones. During the 1980 presidential election, a similar but more significant dirty trick was pulled by the Reagan campaign. Former CIA Director William Casey called this trick an October surprise, coining the term while he was a campaign manager for Reagan. The dirty trick consisted of trips to several Middle Eastern capitals where the campaign delivered a message to Iranian officials. Don't release the hostages before the election. Mr. Reagan will win and give you a better deal. The hostages in question were the 52 American diplomats and citizens who were kidnapped from the United States Embassy in Tehran by the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. While the arms for hostages deal that Reagan delivered and the subsequent diversion of the Iranian funds to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua are well known, the interference in the election has not officially been recognized until recently. On March 18th of this year, while former President Carter awaits his death in hospice care, Mr. Benjamin Barnes, former Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, stepped forward to tell the truth to the New York Times. These dirty tricks are, according to Debord, an indication that the Western nations and what he called the integrated spectacle have realized a kind of fragile perfection. Fragile because the technocratic and technological expansion of this new world order is dangerous, and perfect because no political force can emerge to challenge the current spectacular rule. Let's take a contemporary example of this political aspect of the spectacle, an example many of us are probably trying to forget.
Putin, from everything I see, has no respect for this person.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
And it's pretty clear.
You're the puppet.
It's pretty clear you won't admit that the Russians have engaged in cyber attacks against the United States of America, that you encouraged espionage against our people, that you are willing to spout the Putin line, sign up for his wish list, break up NATO, do whatever he wants to do, and that you continue to get help from him because he has a very clear favorite in this race.
Let's recall the investigation into former President Trump's alleged collusion with the Russian state. First, we should note how the spectacle is lying to us about the scandal. For instance, the Washington Post announced there's now even less reason to blame Clinton for the Russian probe. And a New York Times headline declared, after years of political hype, the Durham inquiry failed to deliver. While the Democratic Socialist podcast and YouTube program The Majority Report declared Trump desperate to find anything in the Durham report. In reality, the Durham report exposed how the Clinton campaign's version of an October surprise pushed the United States further into the spectacle. According to the report, the Hillary Clinton campaign approved a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security services on July 26, 2016. On July 28th, the FBI received information indicating that a low-level Trump campaigner named George Papadopoulos had told Australian commissioners that Trump was sure to win and that the Russians had some dirt on Clinton that might be released during the campaign. FBI agents would later characterize this allegation as thin, but this exchange over drinks, perhaps a couple of cans of Foster's, was the entire basis for the FBI's years-long investigation into collusion. It was the only evidence justifying opening up what was called Crossfire Hurricane that did not originate from within the Clinton campaign. I'll repeat that with more emphasis on the relevance for those of you who still believe you are free citizens. The Russiagate story that convinced half of the American public that the President of the United States was a Manchurian candidate and that the Russians had infiltrated the government and perpetuated a quiet coup was a hoax. It was a dirty trick, an October surprise, pulled off by the Clinton campaign with assistance from the FBI. As an independent journalist and editor of The Tablet, Jacob Siegel noted in his essay, A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, Clinton's October surprise led to the institution of tighter mechanisms of information control, or in Debord's terms, an intensification of the spectacle's rule. Siegel notes, quote, the outgoing Obama-appointed Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security announced that in response to Russian electoral interference, he had designated U.S. election systems as critical national infrastructure. This move included placing all of the media, all communications infrastructure, within the jurisdiction of the Department of Homeland Security, an agency that had itself been formed after the attacks of September 11th in 2001. At the time, the formation of the Department of Homeland Security itself met with headlines like this one from the Dayton Daily News. 1984 finally arrives, 18 years late. Whereas today, under the specter of Russian disinformation campaigns, the quiet monitoring and censoring of newsrooms and social media platforms are barely noted. What we should remember, however, is that even dictators rely on a kind of consent of the governed. So even if Debord is correct in his pessimism, and the government of the spectacle now possesses all the means to falsify the whole of production and perception, and even if it's true that a state bureaucracy is the absolute master of memories, just as it is the unfettered master of projects that will shape the most distant future, we freed citizens are still capable of spotting and remembering the spectacle in crisis. For example, in the United States, we're about to enter an election cycle where we will likely be presented with the choice between an old man suffering from dementia on the one hand, and a cartoon character who wears his immaturity, ignorance, and hostility on his sleeve. We'll do well to remember that both parties are only vying for control over the technocratic mechanism that Debord called the spectacle. And we should prepare ourselves for what will possibly result from this impossible choice, namely a split decision that lands us nowhere but into deeper confusion and chaos. To return to the concept of the spectacle itself, in Debord's first book, he describes it this way. The spectacle cannot be understood as an abuse of the world vision, as a product of the techniques of mass dissemination of images. It is rather a Weltanschauung that has become actual, materially translated. It is a world vision that has become objectified. One specific but important way this world vision is materialized is through a reduction of politics to a choice already made of a unity that only appears divided. That is, the disaster that was the Trump presidency was also the disaster of the Democratic Party's defensive response, the FBI's phony investigations, the expansion of the security state into more and more aspects of our lives, the destruction of even the fig leaf of formal freedoms.
Has to wake up to its social alienation before it's going to get off its ass and worry about economic alienation. Everyone in the last couple months is running around wondering if AI is going to be conscious soon, and Debord's back there wondering if we are ever going to be conscious. Because freedom must include freedom of the imagination. It has to start with imagination.
Plastic Pill's injunction that we should overcome our social isolation is not wrong, but it misleads in so much as it affirms a spectacular vision of who we are. After all, most YouTube viewers will hear this as a call to log off, to touch grass, maybe talk to your neighbor. It is a critique that doesn't go beyond the moralizing despair of a book like Bowling Alone. We do have to overcome our alienation, but what we need to do is going to be more difficult than merely gritting our teeth and going out for a stroll, despite the social anxiety we all suffer from in this post-COVID moment. We can start to orient ourselves again, to become social, but this will not include looking for an alternative lifestyle or finding peace in our hearts. And it certainly can't be reduced to using our imaginations, as that call is usually understood. Instead, as Debord says in his comments, we should try to remember recent history and speak to one another about that. We should be especially insistent on talking about the recent history that has been fractured along partisan lines. If you know in advance what you're supposed to think about something, know what the political valiance of an idea is, what sort of person you're announcing yourself to be by daring to raise a question, this is precisely the topic you need to discuss, you need to think about. Remembering that we haven't always been at war with Eurasia is the first step. After all, a person who immediately forgets the past will never know when he's being lied to.
When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course. You know, I'm one, and I've said it for so long, David, that I really do believe there should be universal wearing of masks. There should be, to the extent possible, social distancing. So you wear a mask. Then you want it to fit better. So one of the ways you could do it, if you would like to, is put a cloth mask over, which actually here and here and here, where you could get leakage in, is much better contained. Okay. That's all they're saying. One mask at least, but if you want to really be sure, get a tighter fit with the second mask.
So wait a minute, are you a double masker, Doctor?
Toward the end of his comments on the Society of the Spectacle, Debord wrote, "We must conclude that a change is imminent in the co-opted caste who manage the domination, and notably, those who direct the protection of that domination. And although it concerns those already installed in the sphere of power, conspiratorially, it will select those who will take part in it on this central requirement, that they clearly know what obstacles they have overcome and of what they are capable. Meanwhile, we are in the awkward position of clearly knowing what obstacles remain and all the ways we have proved ourselves incapable. But this step of seeing the recent past clearly, recognizing how we have inadvertently helped the technocratic spectacle become stronger, is open to us, and taking it could mean that we won't fail, or at least we won't fail in the same way again. We seem to be arriving in that moment wherein the perpetual present of the spectacle can no longer be maintained, a moment when the forces that dominate us will be both unveiled for what they are and sink into a chaos generated by the incompetence which is the spectacle's primary product. In the United States, we appear to be headed into a repetition of the last election. Only this time, we likely won't be locked down, and neither side in the charade will have any claim on morality, competence, insight, or legitimacy.
Sonda, in a lot of ways, you're a model for me. It's so much easier to look at your life than to think about mine. So easy. I just think of something that I like to do, and then the rest takes care of itself. I dream of a world outside of this one. A simpler, gentler place with just us and the children. A world without men doesn't bother me. In fact, I welcome it a bit.